Hello and welcome to the first day of the 34th Annual California Small Farms Conference. If you're here to attend Asian Farmers in California, you're in the right place. My name is Beatriz and I am with the Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and I am excited to have you here today for this year's biggest event. Today's speakers, I want to give you a big thank you for being here, for sharing your stories and your knowledge with us and inspiring us. And also a big thanks to our sponsors for this year who made this conference possible. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and encourage all the participants here today to use the chat room as well as the Q&A function throughout the workshop to communicate with the panelists or ask any questions that you have for them. I do, however, want to remind you to keep it kind and constructive, as this is being recorded and it will be posted online. And as soon as I end this webinar today, you will have an eval pop up in your screen for us here at CAF. We would love to have your constructive thoughts. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Amy, who's going to be introducing herself and share some wonderful stories with us today. Take it away, Amy.
Hey, thank you very much, Beatrice. So good afternoon, or good morning wherever you are, and welcome to the 34th Annual California Small Farm Conference and to our special panel discussion on Asian farmers in California. We're so pleased to have you here today. Special thank you to our organizers for hosting this special talk that's coming up. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I am Amy Wu, an award-winning writer and journalist for the women's ag and ag tech movement. I'm also the founder and creator of From Farms to Incubators, a multimedia platform that uses documentary, video, photography, and the written word to tell the stories of women innovators and leaders in agri-food tech, especially women of color. It does include a documentary and also a new book called From Farms to Incubators, Women Innovators Revolutionizing How Our Food is Grown. And I have been a professional storyteller and journalist for nearly 3 decades. Now, a really brief rundown on how we're going to spend our hour and 15 minutes together today. I'm going to give a brief introduction of what inspired this panel and the topic, and then I'm going to introduce our 3 special speakers and panelists who are going to give their presentations. You're in for a treat. And then I am going to kick us off into a mini Q&A and open it up to you. And I would say that please feel free throughout this session to type your questions, your comments into the chat box, and we will definitely try to address as many of them as possible after the presentations are made. Also, as noted, the session will be recorded. So a little bit about what inspired this session on Asian farmers in California is that it was actually first held at the Eco Farm Conference in 2020 for the first time. And then it was so popular, it was also held a second time in 2021 at Eco Farm. And I do remember we had a standing audience there in person in 2020. It was in part inspired by my work as a journalist and storyteller. In 2016, I was assigned to the Salinas Valley in California to report on agriculture. And I noticed that there appeared to be a lack of minorities, people of color, who are leaders at farms or at major agribusiness companies. And in reporting about ag, and as a woman and a person of color, I became fascinated with collecting the stories of women and also people of color who are transforming agriculture with their contributions, whether it be creativity, innovation, and technology. The reality is that there is a long way to go in both the number of people of color who are landowners and leaders in ag in California, and also in telling the story of the contributions they've made. It is important to understand history if we are to understand the present and consider the future and who owns the land and who is farming the food we eat. And I share that as a history major, by the way. I majored in history at NYU. The history of Asians in agriculture in California is finally an immigrant story. And while the history is often told through the mainstream lens, we tend to ignore contributions by all kinds of other people that make the social fabric of what is the great state of California. So in looking at history, it's important to look at contributions, especially when it comes to ag. So the vision for this talk today is to increase awareness and knowledge of both the challenges and contributions of Asian farmers in California through the lens of history, the past, and to use that to examine and discuss the present and the future. How can history be preserved and remembered and serve as a foundation for a better and brighter and more hopeful future? So this is a segue into the presentations. So I want to take a step back and share a little bit is that we have 3 presenters today, okay? So a couple of our presenters are still, might be a little bit late, but we are keeping our fingers crossed that they are going to be showing up and overcome some tech issues. But I'm going to start today. I'm really proud to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Robina Bhatti. So Dr. Vadi was born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan. She is an academic, activist, and an organic farmer herself. She is a professor of global studies at Cal State Monterey Bay and has been there for the past 27 years. Her expertise is in the areas of global political economy, global politics, and ecology. Her class on global ecology focuses on agriculture and led her into getting into organic farming herself. As a farmer, she engages in agroecological practices, draws on her Punjabi farming heritage, and helps weave together and connect academics, activism, and love of land. Robina's Organics has specialized in Asian vegetables. Sounds delicious. Okay, so Robina will be presenting right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a slideshow that I want to share with you. And so just give me a minute here. And I'm wondering if you can all see this. And if you can, I'm just going to go ahead. So I'm happy to join CAF in its annual conference today. And I'm joining CAF in this webinar from the territory of the Esselen tribe. They are the original stewards of this land. They hold the memory, the traditions, and the culture of this land. And in relation to farming, they hold the knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. I am going to add to the stories, various stories of Asian farming in California. And I'm particularly interested in looking at the miracle of California, the miracle especially in agriculture. So California, of course, is dominates in all aspects of agriculture, and I'm very curious and would like to have wanted to find out how this agricultural miracle called California has been produced. To understand this miracle, just another bit of information on California's miracle. It is necessary to tell the stories of, let me go back here, to tell the stories of different people, especially Asians, because the mainstream story, as Amy said, is quite whitewashed. This story could be told as a story of how turmeric became global. So turmeric arrived here from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and I'm featuring today the South Asians of California, but particularly one group among the South Asians, the Punjabis. And so I want to make visible, let me go back to this before South Asians became visible and after that. And before, when they were invisible, how they've become visible and how they have become invisible. Where did the original Punjabis, who are the original South Asians that came to the western coast of North America, come from? This is where they came from. It includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Maldives, which is not shown here, Sri Lanka, 8 countries in all. And they have been traveling and migrating to different parts of the world. Now, migration is ongoing. It is not just a few people that migrate. Migration is displacement for whatever reason. It is never individual. It is not just collective, but it is global. So you can track a history of our world from a globalized lens and a globalized political economy as well. In recovering the memories of some of our migrants, my focus is on South Asia, particularly Punjabi agriculturists of the colonized pre-partition India. This is the Punjab. As you can see, it's part of Pakistan, it's part of India as well, and my heritage is from Western Pakistan. So Indians started to come to California in the 19th century. Punjab was among the last regions in India to come under British rule, which of course, once colonizers take over, displace people. And since this is the breadbasket of South Asia, displaced a lot of farmers, the Sikhs that were coming here were called terrorists by the British. And so you can imagine the kind of displacement that must have taken place. About 90% of the Indian migrants to Western United States came from the Punjab, mostly were Sikhs. And the new migrants, when they arrived on the Western shores here, were called Indians, East Indians in particular, and Hindus, though, as I said, 90% of them were Sikhs, there were Muslims, and very few Hindus at first. They found jobs in lumber, on the railroads, and because they were agriculturalists, came with agrarian dreams, they began to move into agriculture. So I kind of wanted to look at the entanglement of the foodways in agrarian capitalism. So 3 features of capitalism: capital, of course, and land and labor. And the more interesting story, though I can talk about capital, I want to talk about the land and the labor. These two are constantly commodified, or you have the transformation of nature and human activity into objects that can be bought and sold on the market. Wage labor, of course, is fundamental to the capitalist production, and this is one more story of agrarian capitalism. So California's agriculture is successful. This miracle is produced by different people, not just white population. Agriculture is dependent on a repetitive cycle of recruitment, employment, exploitation, exclusion. The majority have been non-white. Here are just some of the groups that you can see and recognize today. South Asian farmers, once they began to acquire land, had 3 different locations where they spread out to the Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Valley, and the Imperial Valley. By 1920, this is a big deal. It seems like only 2,099 acres, but it's a lot of land owned by a migrant population. But in addition, because they were good at farming, they were also leasing farmland. Land was almost exclusively in the Sacramento Valley and Imperial Valleys at first, and it's later that they begin to move into the Central Valley as well. They grew cash crops that they were familiar with in their own heritage, and they faced the kinds of challenges that Larry and Al will be talking about, all of the discriminatory laws that happen, always accompanied with violence. And so I just give you one shot of this. They were community building people, and the community initially centered around the gurdwaras, or the Sikh temples. And of course, as all migrants wanted to belong, it was a source of pride when they did. The most interesting part of the story that I've always looked into is the Mexican Hindu community. This is the marriage between Punjabi males and Hispanic or Mexican women. And I'll play a short video about this that gives you the story, so I won't go over each slide here. And so here is my video that I talked about, and sorry. So I'm going to get out of this to give you just give me a minute here, and this is what I wanted to share. Can you see this?
So Robina, we can't see the video.
Oh, you can. So let me
No,
stop
it's
share.
playing, we heard some music, but couldn't see the video.
Okay, just let me stop this and toggle this a little bit so then you can see it. And when I start again, let me see. So tell me now if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, should I start over a little bit or it will take up too much time?
Oh, no, please.
Oh, no,
start
please.
over.
So I'll just start here. Let me stop share and go back to my slideshow and talk a little bit about after this initial, so looking for my, okay, here we go. I'm going to go back to my slideshow. So the community, of course, took root, and then you have more Hindus and Muslims starting to come in, and I'm not quite sure what was going on there. So let me go back to my slideshow again, and something happened here that here is where I wanted to go on to the beyond and after. The first Asian House of Representative was the Leap Sing Sound, and he was from the Imperial Valley. And then this is really early on, 1957, where in the Imperial Valley, a lot of the land is owned by Punjabis and other migrants as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the foodways as well. And foodways, how beliefs and traditions are connected to food and how they formulate cultural identity among communities. So what you have is a rich agricultural tradition that's coming from somewhere else, it has its encounter with a different agricultural identity and mostly cultural practices, which is industrial agriculture at this time, because California is on the cutting edge of this massive change to industrial agriculture. But people, whoever the migrants are, they bring with them a history. It provides them with a connection to the land, to their homeland, and food is an anchor to cultural identity. So you have these, you can explain why naan is one of the favorite flatbreads today in these historical, political, economic, cultural kinds of terms. And the restaurant that was referred to in the video, Al Rasul's Ranchero restaurant in Yuba City, is not owned by Sikhs, was owned by a Muslim and Hispanic Muslim Hispanic couple. It doesn't exist any longer. It went out of business a few years ago. So you can begin to recognize some of the fruits and the vegetables that are part of a regular diet of Punjabis. Mooli, which you can recognize is a form of daikon, bitter melon, which also comes from Southeast Asia, fenugreek, which is called methi, and a kind of squash called tinda, very popular in this diet. Today you have Punjabi farmers that are third generation farmers who farm not just in terms of the California mode, but also farm with their own heritage vegetables as well. They own orchards, and then they continue with this tradition I'm always used to, and while farming would get my food, which was always a Mexican food truck, but the Punjabis have, they call them dhabbas. They have their own Indian food trucks. Orchard, strawberry farmers. If you look over, drive through Salinas, you see mostly they are Chicano, Mexican farmers. And in the Sacramento Valley, you will find a different kind of farmer doing the same thing. Always for the Sikhs, the Punjabis, it is around the temple that most of the activity is centered around. This is also true for the Hindus, and it's true for the Muslims as well. So you could easily have someone else on a tractor, and I included this photograph because you have a rich heritage, Mexican heritage, south of the border heritage, Black farming heritage, and there's all these stories that come together to explain the story of California's agricultural miracle. It's not just water, it's not just land. Labor has a huge story to tell here. And then they are very much globally situated, which means their support for the farmers in India, the protest that was ongoing last year, where Modi had to cave in this year. They're still waiting for the laws to be repealed. They were very supportive of the Indian farmers in their protest. And this kind of tradition is alive and well. You will, if you drive through some of the Punjabi enclaves, you will see people like this, and you have a young generation, very literate, in the know, that still wants to carry on traditions. And the original farmers, as I said, they're in the third generation farmers. I came across this report as far as the Central Valley was concerned. I'd only been looking at Sacramento Valley and Imperial Valley, and I'm going to end. This is a picture of the fenugreek, methi, that I produced, and some of the turmeric. So this is a global story, and I'm going to stop here. And
So
hope
Robina,
I'm
that was just excellent. There's so many parts of that that I loved. I mean, first of all, the video, fascinating, part of chapter of history, and the end of your presentation made me really hungry, actually, as well.
Okay.
So thank you for sharing that. And a reminder to our audience and attendees out there to please put your questions in the chat, and we will address them after the presentation. So our second speaker, I'm really proud to share about his background, is Larry Hirohara. Larry grew up on a family vineyard farm in Madera, California, and has worked in the Salinas Valley in the seed industry for 40 years. He currently lives on the family farm in Madera, growing organic raisins and blueberries. He will be presenting a bit about Japanese and Japanese American farmers in the Salinas Valley. Thank you.
Can you hear me well? Line's okay? Okay, thank you very much, Amy. Also, Robina, that's a fascinating story that you told. But I'm going to tell a story about the Asians in the Salinas Valley and how they're involved with agriculture. My name is Larry Hirohara, agriculturalist, organic grower, historian. Some people call me Blueberry Larry. That's one of my monikers, things that I do. So I grew up on a family farm and worked in Salinas for many years. So I currently live there and farm my organic blueberries there. I became involved in cultural and historic preservation as president of the Buddhist temple, as there was a Chinatown revitalization plan developed in Salinas. The cultural and historic preservation theme is agriculture and the immigrant story. That's what it ended up being as far as preserving history and culture of Chinatown. Agriculture was the predominant business and in the beginning of Salinas, and the need for cheap labor was especially important. The Spreckle sugar plant shown here was needed cheap farm labor, and that was especially important. The Spreckle sugar plant was developing into the largest sugar plant in the world, and growing sugar beets required much labor, which was attractive to immigrants. Thus, the need for cheap labor is the typical immigrant story. I will tell a story about agricultural history of immigration, barriers to them, and innovation of Asian, especially Japanese, in agriculture in the Salinas Valley. It's through my involvement with Asian Cultural Experience, which is a nonprofit group whose goal is historic and cultural preservation, that I was able to learn history of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants. Early Salinas Valley history began with mission days of producing food for the mission. Later, dryland farming was developed for the grain, though Mission San Antonio was one of the first irrigation systems developed in California as they transported water from the Salinas River to their fields. In 1896, Klaus Spreckels came to the Salinas Valley to establish the largest sugar refinery in the world, and growing sugar beets required much labor. Klaus Spreckels is considered the precursor to intensive agriculture in the Salinas Valley, and I might say that his place in history is ambivalent. I want to talk about immigration history and tie it back to agriculture. The Chinese were the first to arrive in the Salinas Valley. They migrated to locations generally in California upon the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the end of the gold rush. That would be 1870. Mainly men were merchants, houseboys, cooks, or farm laborers. The Chinese were significant in agriculture because they were able to dig the gravity flow drainages that still exist today in Salinas, Templo de Oro Slough. They helped build Spreckels' own railroad to transport their sugar, and made deals with landowners to clear their land, especially in the Blanco area, which had very heavy clay soils and were covered with willows. The Chinese were given a 5-year lease to use the land, but had to clear the willows and establish drainage. even at a no rent cost. After clearing the land, the tenants only had 1 or 2 years to grow a cash crop to recoup the labor before giving it back to the landlord. The Chinese also worked in the sugar beet fields, but most were not farmers. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act ended Chinese immigration. The Chinese already were here, were allowed to stay, but they became a dwindling source of cheap labor. Sorry about that. The need for cheap labor created an opportunity for people in Japan who were experiencing economic and political pressure to immigrate. I want to talk about, this is one of the references I use in this book, developed by the Salinas JACL for family histories of Issei families before the World War II. So I wanted to note that. So immigrants from Japan were issued passports by the government of Japan. And labor contractors from Salinas came to recruit laborers promising work. When they arrived in Salinas, labor contractors had built boarding houses that housed and fed them in. In Salinas, there was a racial bias, so the Japanese boarders ended up in next to the Chinese in quote Chinatown, as that was the only place they were allowed to stay. Some immigrated early to Hawaii to work at sugarcane fields, but the plantation life was even less desirable, and they heard about Spreckles and traveled to Salinas to find better work. Sugar beet work was intensive, but also very seasonal. The Japanese immigrants were very entrepreneurial. So they began ancillary businesses such as trucking and growing vegetables and beet as sharecroppers. The 1907-8 Gentleman's Agreement established between Japan and the United States stopped the issuance of passports by Japan to the United States, effectively ending immigration. The agreement did allow wives of Japanese men already in the United States to receive passports and immigrate. The agreement, this exception created the phenomenon known as picture brides. Japanese men in the United States would arrange for a trusted family friend to arrange a marriage, and sometimes their only contact might be the exchange of pictures. That's the name, picture bride. The go-between was known as a baishakunin, thus circumventing the gentleman's agreement. Although most arrangements worked out, this is a unique time and place in history. Thus, the early Japanese immigrants became families and working units. In 1913, passes the California Alien Land Law, barred aliens, but mainly Japanese and obviously Indians, from owning or leasing land. The Federal Exclusion Act barred Japanese entirely in 1924. The 1942 Executive Order 9066 ordered incarcerations for Japanese Americans and aliens were forced to relocate to internment camps. But this created an even greater need for labor. And according to the Salinas Buddhist Temple history, there were over 300 families as members of the temple before the war, and only about 50 families returned. The Tanamura family, partners in TNA, had nothing during the war, or lost everything during the war. They came back, started over, and achieved all their success since that time. With the Chinese and Japanese Exclusion Act, shared along with the unavailability of Japanese as laborers, other sources were sought, and now Baguio will speak about the Filipino experience after me. The Japanese involved in egg production and innovation. Oh, excuse me. This is a shot of the Salinas Rodeo grounds, which served as an assembly center until the camps were actually developed and posted. The early Japanese immigrants were mainly farmers in Japan, and that became their niche in the Salinas Valley. First as sharecroppers or leasing land in the hopes and aspiration of eventually owning that land. From their experience and farming skills, they became successful farmers. This knowledge is passed on through generations about the holistic approach of viewing and understanding plant growth. The adaptation of Japanese growers to integrate low in nitrogen products like manures and irrigation techniques like precision irrigation allowed them great success growing intensive fruits and vegetables. Probably no crop demonstrates these attributes greater than the strawberries. There's a need for small amounts of nitrogen throughout the growing season, the roots that are very sensitive to overwatering, and farming on hilly terrain created many challenges that required constant oversight. So they had to farm sandy ground, which created a need for frequent irrigations, but not too much, or the plants would suffer. So first they were irrigators. With very short runs to control the moisture, and if the sandy soil happened to be on hilly ground, then terraced furrows were a requirement. Many times these fields were not the most desirable fields that row crop farmers wanted, so they had to adapt to these conditions as well. This created a 24/7 requirement to have a successful crop. Knowing how much manure and additive fertilizers was also an expertise that they acquired through constant observation and experimentation. That's only part of the equation. So what was the model used to grow and harvest strawberries? For those unknown to sharecropping, in that era, it was a term that meant landowners would have a person, usually a family, grow a crop on his land with the family supplying the labor to grow and harvest the crop. Usually all material inputs were provided by the landowner, and the family supplied the labor of growing and harvesting. And at the end of the season, each person would get an agreed upon share of the crop's profits. Strawberries generally were split half and half. This picture shows part of the 200-acre strawberry farm in 1924. It had a master lease by the Yamamoto family, and they organized 40 Japanese families to sharecrop their own plots. Obviously beneficial to have a large family, but they had to grow a crop, and if unsuccessful growing, they had a poor harvest and a poor return. The harvest was most labor intensive, so much input was required. The cooperation and organizational skills required for sharecropping was a daunting task, but the Japanese remained the predominant strawberry growers well into the 70s. Currently, they remain in industry, but a small percentage growing. The emerging strawberry growers today are Hispanic. This illustrates the immigrant story of those willing to sacrifice the 24/7 attention that the crop requires. The current business model is a modified sharecropping. Much of the lettuce grown before World War II was done by Japanese growers. It's estimated that over 60% of vegetables grown in the Slaves Valley were grown by Japanese. Also made them subject to a fair amount of jealousy as well. I end the Japanese story with World War II, and does not include the second wave of Japanese immigrants that developed the cut flower industry after the war. I think I'll shut it off there because Al needs some time as well. And I'm going to stop share screen right now.
Thank you very much, Larry. The photos are really powerful. And if I didn't mention this earlier, when we did this in person, there used to be a mini exhibition of some of the photographs, and maybe we will return to that in the future. So our last but not least, third panelist today is Al Baguio. Really proud to give some background about him, is that he's a second generation resident of Monterey County and a native of Salinas. His father immigrated to the United States in 1923 and settled in Salinas when he was a young boy. Al's father worked in the fields all of his life, mostly as an irrigator, but Al himself worked in the fields during high school summers and during his years attending Hartnell College. He is the president of the Monterey County Historical Society and past president of the Filipino American National Historical Society. He earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from San Jose State and his master's from Golden Gate University. And he was employed by the Monterey County Probation Department for 32 years before he before he retired. So look forward to hearing his presentation next. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Amy. Well, since I was asked to present information about the Filipinos in the Salinas Valley and the surrounding areas, that will be my historical focus regarding the presentation. I'll try my best to answer the following questions. 1, why Filipinos came to the Salinas Valley? 2, the impact they had on the Salinas Valley agricultural industry. 3, the discrimination they faced, which led to the Wattsville race riots in the 1930s. 4, the virtual disappearance of Filipinos as an agricultural labor force in the Salinas Valley. 5, Filipinos who attempted to try to become produce growers. After the Spanish-American War, which the United States won, the United States obtained several territories, the Philippine Islands being one of them. The Philippines being under the protectorate of the United States, Filipinos were considered U.S. nationals and were free to emigrate to the United States. The first Filipinos came to the Salinas Valley around 1919. They came from practically from every island in the Philippines. For example, my father came from an island of Siquijor, located on the southern part of the Philippine Islands. There are few jobs to be had on that island. The population subsisted on what vegetables they grew and raised the few animals that they owned, on what little land that they owned. The barter system was the system used because of the scarcity of real money, like many young Filipinos on the island. My father were faced with chronic poverty and he left his home. He went to the island of Cebu and got a job cleaning fish on the docks of Dumaguete, $1 for 1 day's work. One day a ship came to Dumaguete, which is a port city in Cebu, that was seeking laborers to work in the sugar cane and pineapple plantations in Hawaii. The combinations of lures and enticements by the agribusiness complex in Hawaii and California, and the harsh employment and social conditions in the Philippine Islands was an opportunity too good to pass up. My father and his cousin, who had joined him in Cebu, lied about their age, signed contracts to work in the sugarcane and pineapple fields in Hawaii. Hawaii then was a stepping stone for most Filipinos who eventually emigrated to the United States. The Filipinos was a cheap source of labor for most of the farmers in the Salinas Valley. They worked long hours, harvesting produce and living in substandard housing located on the grower's property. The wages paid them ranged from 10 cents to $1 an hour. There were no health benefits, no overtime or sick leave. If you didn't work, for whatever reason, you didn't get paid. Filipinos was a major labor force in the Salinas Valley. Mexicans and a few Japanese and Chinese also worked in the agricultural fields, but not in a significant number. Those Filipinos who were ambitious became labor contractors. Labor contractors were middlemen that furnished workers to growers to harvest their crops. The labor contractors were paid by the growers and received a portion of the worker's salary. It was a common practice that most labor contractors hired men from their own island in the Philippines. Now, what were the causes of the anti-Filipino riots in cities and towns all over California in the 1930s? The combination of 5 days of vigilante terror known as the Wattsville riots, a variety of motives for anger and cruelty of these mobs. The mobs connected their motives and supplied the energy that burst the bonds of civility and was an explosive mixture of racism and sex. These statements was from Bob Danziger's book, Sounds and Experience of Filipino Americans. The Filipino workers rented a beach hall in the Watsonville area for a dance and social event. There were few Filipino women, if any, that were in the United States. The Filipino workers invited white women to their dance and social partners. The white men population got wind of the situation and were angry that Filipinos had the nerve to associate with white women. About 500 white men descended on the hall and brutalized the Filipino workers. This led to 5 days of rioting in which one Filipino worker was killed and scores of Filipinos were injured. The discriminatory attitude toward Filipinos affected a major portion of California, especially in the Salinas Valley. Filipino workers gradually disappeared from the Salinas Valley agricultural fields. They were replaced by Mexican workers through the Bracero program, which became California's source of labor for the growers. The aging of Filipino immigrants also was a contributing factor. The Filipino immigrants who initially came to the United States encouraged their children to get an education or develop skills to spare the hardship of agricultural field work. There were several Filipinos who tried to grow the farming business, and they wanted to grow their own produce. The most notable growers were the Metalora Farms, which is located on the Tividad Road. Henry Garcia, who tried to grow lettuce in the Watsonville and Grave District, and Magdalena Reganai tried to grow strawberries in the Toro Park area. They experienced minimal success and soon gave up on the agricultural growers business. In conclusion, the Filipinos initially was the main labor force that made Salinas Valley the produce capital of the nation. The labor camp building located at the Monterey County Historical Society at the Baranda Adobe is a reminder of Filipinos' contributions to the agricultural industry. And that's my presentation. I hope I answered all the questions that were posed in my presentation.
Thank you, Al. That was really powerful. And thank you for sharing those photographs as well. So all of our presenters have shared. We're going to move into our Q&A, question and answers. We really would like to get questions from the attendees. I see that the number of attendees has actually increased, so that's wonderful. I don't know where everybody's joining from, but so please feel free to put your questions or thoughts into the box. But I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions, I think, from my end to all of the panelists there, and please feel free to, to jump in. So can you comment a bit about what is being done to preserve, document, and also amplify the contributions of Asian farmers? So much of your presentations were really powerful with the photographs and the actual stories, right? And Al, with you sharing your own personal story as well. So what is being done? What are you doing now? Or, what is being done in your communities to preserve that and to continue to amplify, like I said, Asian farmer contributions? Robina, do you want to start? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, so it is quite a long history, and the impact of all of these struggles is that in some ways, South Asian farmers are not considered marginal. because there are huge farms owned by people of South Asian descent, and they contribute to whatever it is that California is exporting back to the countries that originally had the products that they brought with them. And then you can see this in the legislature too. It has been a number of years now, maybe almost a decade and a half, where all the instructions now that come from the extension agencies and from the California government, they're in Chinese, they're in Japanese, they are in Vietnamese, but they are also in Punjabi. So that means, we're part of the official now. And then, is there still discrimination? I think that was part of the written question. Yes, very much, because it's still presented as a whitewashed history when you are leaving out so much of the story. So I'll stop here to give Larry and Elle a chance.
Larry?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question was, can you comment a bit about what is being currently done, or as we look forward to preserve, document, and amplify the contributions of Asian and Asian American farmers? Do you see that increasing as well, those efforts?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties. Yes, I'd say one of the organizations that I deal with, I talked about Asian cultural experience. I mean, that's our stated goal, is preserving the history and culture of Asians in Chinatown, including Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos. And we're attempting to build a museum, cultural center to display this information, with agricultural immigration as probably a intertwining theme of our information, or our story. The theme of the story is agriculture. So sorry, I don't know what happened to mine.
Excellent. It looks like maybe there are some folks who'd like to follow up with you on that one as well, the development of that. Al, is there anything that you'd like to contribute also about that?
No, not really.
It's great that you guys are joining us in the same room. That's wonderful. Let's see if there's any questions. I see that we have some comments, though. I've learned so much in this presentation, and thank you to all. What is next in terms of what else do you feel like is needed, I guess, to further preserve the heritage and history of contributions, and not just past contributions, but current stories as well? What do you think is needed?
This is Larry. I'd say that one of the things that is being done that needs to be amplified is like oral histories, because we started some oral history projects in the Chinatown area, gosh, over 15 years ago. Unfortunately, many of the stories that could be told, those people have passed away, so their stories go with them. So that's an unfortunate part. Sorry to say, or sad to say, that I'm becoming part of that era also, of having a lot of history, and maybe that should be better recorded.
Yeah, I think that written documentation should be one of the focus on preserving the historical history of the Filipinos, Japanese, and Chinese, and the documentations should reflect, their contributions to the agricultural industry in Swains Valley and California in general.
Were there any, to all of our panelists, what inspired all of you to I guess, preserve this part of history, and maybe seeking out photographs and the stories? And were there any challenges that you ran into in finding the information?
Go ahead, Robina.
Okay, so for me, of course, it's personal, and it is part of my heritage. And I saw my grandparents, both sets of my grandparents, farming. And so I'm very connected to that. But then the things that I teach locate all of this movement, displacement, the integrated political economy in a global picture. So it's not an isolated story that you are talking about. It's a history that's a very dynamic history. And unfortunately, what we see all around us is a very linear history. These superior, powerful people, were it not for them, this would not happen. And there are many parts of this story, which for me, more and more when someone does the collection, when someone does the work that Larry and Al have been doing, you recover this more parts of that story. And so, if it becomes apparent in literature and in fiction, in documentaries and in movies, in collections and libraries, and making people visible who have actually worked in the fields and know what they're talking about, that helps the whole story along.
I'd say that one of the things that comes up is, I always try to say, never forget this. You should never forget and then tell the story. And in some cases that comes up maybe to the forefront with, let's say, anti-Asian hate issues. I mean, you wouldn't think that it shouldn't happen, but for some reason it happened again. So we need to remember our history and then not let it repeat itself. In the bad things anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent point. Al, did you have something to add on that as well? And what inspired you?
What inspired me to, well, my dad and my uncle always encouraged me to get out of the field and to get an education and tell me that there are better jobs, better fields that you could pursue other than doing field work. And that's what we did. All my my brothers and my sisters, they all left the agricultural field and pursue other ambitions that they wanted to pursue.
Yeah, I might add that on our ranch, it was a relatively small ranch, maybe like 60 acres.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, the family did all the work. And so it was a requirement to work. And the option was that if you don't want to do this, you better get an education. So you learn the lesson kind of, in a sense, the hard way. That this is hard work, and you have an opportunity to try something maybe a little better if you were there. And education was the option.
So we have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. One of them that came in from Kelly Matsushita Zhang is, given the challenges of Asian farmers in California in the past and the challenges that still persist today, like including land access, lack of resources, what are your thoughts on better supporting the next generation or current generation of Asian and Asian American farmers? And please feel free to jump in, whatever order. What are your thoughts on that?
There's opportunity for Asian farmers. Maybe there may be greater economic opportunities in other fields, but as far as supporting them, I don't. That's a good question. I think that there's a lack of dedicated support of that particular ethnic group to become farmers at whatever size and level they want to become. Maybe there's some very large ones still that exist today, but it's so capital intensive, and it's only because you inherit it that you can continue that particular legacy. Very difficult, and I think it's a fair question. It's a valid question, and I don't at this point in time, don't really see a tremendous amount of dedicated support for that particular occupation.
So I would say, oh, Larry, were you done?
Yes, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, so I would say, and I say this to my students, and doesn't come across that well, is a lot of opportunities exist in agriculture as far as jobs are concerned. And to say this to students who are running away from agriculture and their heritage doesn't sound very wonderful, but given the challenges that we have, especially ownership of land, especially being able to advance, and then also losing heritage farms, that is a huge challenge. And it doesn't ever change because of the graciousness of the powers that are. So I would say for everyone located wherever they are, whatever the heritage is, you learn as you grow how you can negotiate whatever it is that is going on. But the one really important thing is, given similar histories, given facing similar challenges and oppressions, there is a natural kind of base for coming together to demand, to negotiate, to renegotiate what might be going on. And so I would say this for all of our Chicano farmers that have made significant progress is because they've come together united. If we're going to have any further progress, we need to all work together because we recognize what the challenges are and we recognize who the oppressors are everywhere in the world.
I think that we'll try to answer these questions as best we can if we don't finish all of them. One of the things that question about Asian opportunities, I think Amy's life's work right now pretty well reflects the opportunities that may be available for people of color and women, especially in ag tech, which is could be a burgeoning field and a great opportunity. So, we have somebody in our presence that can actually be a advocate.
So Larry, thanks for bringing that up as well, because I have been documenting the stories. One thing I was going to answer for that question from Kelly was that by telling our stories and by sharing our stories and to the next generation, seeing people who look like ourselves, that reflect the diversity, I think is really, really important. So I have been collecting the stories of women innovators and entrepreneurs in agri-food tech, and we have a directory with 650 names of women who have put their own names on there now. The organizers are telling me that we have to end just a few minutes early. So what I'm going to be putting in the box, the chat box here, is that if you want to connect and get the latest on, have any additional questions, or you want to connect with Al, Larry, Robina, myself, and follow up because there was so much rich material, please place your name and email or any contact information in this Google Doc, and our speakers will also do that as well. And also feel free to put in any resources also. The one thing I was going to say is that the photographs in these presentations are so beautiful and so rich. And the first time we held it at Eco Farm, we had a mini exhibition afterwards with these beautiful photos. So in the future, I realized that our time was a little bit short today, but in the future, we certainly hope to share these, the story, the presentations in different ways again, and maybe a bit of the photographs. And we'd like to hear more from our audience. Maybe we'll be able to do it in person next year and hear from some of you out there. Otherwise, I think that we were going to have to wrap this up, and I want to thank all of our panelists who put in so much time in pulling together such really rich presentations, just excellent. And I'm sure there's going to be questions afterwards from folks who attended this session. And thank you very much to our host, for allowing the presentation today, and to the conference organizers. So thank you very much for everybody's time.
Thank you, Amy, and Larry and Elle as well, and to our participants and attendees.